I'm Rebecca, 34 years old, and I never thought I'd find satisfaction watching my sister Natalie turn pale at my mother's funeral. 6 years earlier, she had stolen James, my millionaire fiancé, crushing my heart and destroying our family. But as Natalie entered the church and locked eyes with my husband Michael, her face drained of color, her champagne glass slipping from her fingers. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the somber room, much like how my world had shattered years before. If you're ready for a story about betrayal, unexpected karma, and finding true love from the ashes of heartbreak, please let me know where you're watching from. Hit subscribe and stay with me. Because the truth behind Natalie's reaction changed everything I thought I knew. Growing up in our middle-class Boston suburb, my relationship with Natalie was complicated from the beginning. Our modest colonial home on Maple Street housed a family dynamic that shaped both of us in vastly different ways. I was the older sister, by 2 years, always the responsible one with my nose buried in books, while Natalie was the vivacious beauty who could charm anyone with a single smile. From an early age, the contrast between us was stark. I had my father's serious brown eyes and practical nature, preferring to spend weekends organizing my bookshelf or preparing for debate tournaments. Natalie inherited our mother's striking blue eyes and natural charisma, turning heads wherever she went. While I struggled with social anxiety and found refuge in academic achievements, Natalie effortlessly collected friends and admirers. Our parents, though loving, displayed clear favoritism. Mom always beamed with pride, showcasing Natalie at family gatherings, while my academic certificates and trophies gathered dust on a shelf in the hallway. "Beauty opens doors that brains take too long to unlock," Mom would say, adjusting Natalie's hair before taking photos. Dad, though more balanced in his affection, rarely contradicted this dynamic. The pattern started small. Natalie would borrow my favorite sweater without asking and return it stained. She'd befriend the same people I cautiously opened up to, quickly becoming their preferred companion. Once in high school, she even pursued Ryan, my lab partner who had finally worked up the courage to ask me to junior prom. 2 days after I excitedly accepted his invitation, he awkwardly rescinded it. I later discovered Natalie had convinced him they'd have more fun together. "It's not my fault people prefer me," she'd shrug when I confronted her, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "Maybe if you weren't so uptight all the time, people would choose you too." Despite these painful episodes, I channeled my energy into academics. My persistence paid off when I was accepted to Columbia Law School with a partial scholarship. New York represented freedom from the shadow of my sister and the constant comparisons. The distance gave me space to breathe, to discover who Rebecca truly was without being defined as Natalie's boring sister. During those 3 years, I limited contact with my family. Holiday visits were brief, and I invented internships and study groups to keep my stays short. I flourished in the competitive environment of law school, graduating in the top 5% of my class and securing a position at Parker & Winters, a prestigious firm with offices in Boston and New York. When the opportunity arose to transfer to the Boston office after 2 years in New York, I hesitated. I had built a life independent of family dynamics and old wounds, but my father's subtle mentions of Mom's increasing health issues and Natalie's latest dramatic breakup tugged at my conscience. Perhaps with professional success under my belt and years of independence, I could rebuild those family bonds from a position of strength. So I returned to Boston at 28, established in my career and financially secure. I bought a sleek downtown apartment, a tangible symbol of my success and independence. The old Rebecca might have sought approval from her family for such an achievement. The new Rebecca simply invited them to a housewarming party, accepting their attendance or absence with equal grace. To my surprise, they all came. Dad beamed with pride as he inspected the views from my 20th floor windows. Mom, though clearly uncomfortable in the modern setting, made an effort to compliment my decor choices. And Natalie, now working as a retail manager after several abandoned career paths, brought an expensive bottle of wine and a seemingly genuine interest in my life. "I've missed having my big sister around," she said that night, as we stood on my balcony overlooking the city lights. "Maybe we can start over? Do sister things together?" Her blue eyes, so like our mother's, held what appeared to be sincere affection. After years of therapy and personal growth, I was cautiously ready to believe that people, even Natalie, could change. Perhaps adult siblings could forge new bonds, unburdened by childhood rivalries. "I'd like that," I replied, clinking, my glass against hers. For several months, this new relationship flourished. We had Sunday brunches, occasional shopping trips, and even attended a cooking class together. I began to lower my guard, to believe that perhaps the painful past could stay where it belonged, in the past. Little did I know, the stage was being set for a betrayal that would dwarf all that had come before. I first met James Warren at the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala in downtown Boston. Parker and Winters had sponsored a table, and as one of the rising stars in the firm, I was asked to attend and help entertain important clients. James was seated at our table as the CEO of Warren Tech, a rapidly expanding software company that had recently retained our services for their upcoming IPO. Even in a room full of successful, wealthy individuals, James stood out. Tall, with dark blonde hair and piercing green eyes, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something from nothing. Unlike many self-made millionaires I'd encountered through work, he lacked the abrasive edge of someone constantly needing to prove themselves. "So you're the brilliant attorney John keeps raving about," he said after introductions, his smile reaching his eyes as he referenced my boss. "He claims you saved the Anderson merger single-handedly." "John exaggerates," I responded, though secretly pleased my work had been noticed. "It was a team effort." "Modest, too," James observed, a rare quality in our circles. Throughout dinner, we discovered surprising connections. Both of us had grown up in middle-class families, worked multiple jobs through college, and shared a passion for education reform. While others at the table discussed yacht purchases and vacation homes, James and I found ourselves deep in conversation about first-generation college students and the mentoring program he'd established. "Would you consider joining our advisory board?" he asked as the evening wound down. "We need people who understand both the legal landscape and the reality these kids face." It was ostensibly a professional invitation, but the way his hand lingered on mine as he handed me his card suggested potential for more. I accepted both implications with a smile. Our first date occurred 3 days later. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, far from the corporate crowd. James arrived in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, a stark contrast to the tuxedo he'd worn at the gala. This James was even more appealing, relaxed, funny, and genuinely interested in my thoughts on everything from immigration policy to my favorite novels. "Most people see the millionaire tech guy and stop there," he admitted over tiramisu. "It's refreshing to be with someone who asks about the person behind the bank account." Over the following months, our relationship deepened. James was attentive in ways I hadn't experienced before, remembering small details from our conversations, sending thoughtful gifts related to my interests rather than just expensive jewelry, and respecting my demanding work schedule rather than making me feel guilty about it. When I nervously introduced him to my family over Thanksgiving dinner, he navigated the dynamics with charm and grace. Dad was impressed by James's business acumen, Mom was captivated by his charisma and success, and even Natalie seemed genuinely happy for me, at least initially. As we cleared dishes after dessert, I noticed Natalie engaging James in what appeared to be innocent conversation. She tossed her hair back, laughing a bit too loudly at his jokes, standing slightly closer than necessary. It was subtle, a touch on the arm here, an extended gaze there, but I recognized the behaviors from our childhood. The familiar unease settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. We were adults now, and surely Natalie wouldn't pursue her sister's serious boyfriend. "Your sister is quite charming," James commented as we drove home. "You two seem very different." "We are," I replied simply, not wanting to delve into our complicated history. James nodded, not pursuing the subject further, and I convinced myself there was nothing to worry about. As our one-year anniversary approached, James became mysteriously busy with meetings and phone calls he wouldn't elaborate on. I feared he might be losing interest, but then he surprised me with a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard. On our second night, during a private dinner on the beach at sunset, he knelt in the sand and presented a stunning 3-carat emerald-cut diamond ring. "You've shown me what real partnership means, Rebecca," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "I want to build a life with you, someone who challenges me intellectually, supports me unconditionally, and loves me for who I really am, not what I have. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred my vision as I accepted. The orphaned girl who never felt quite good enough, who always worked twice as hard for half the recognition, was finally being chosen first. We set a date for the following spring, an elegant but intimate affair for 100 guests at the Boston Public Library. Everything seemed perfect. I had a challenging career I loved, a handsome, successful fiancé who adored me, and even a newly positive relationship with my family. For once, I was living the life that had always seemed reserved for others. For people like Natalie. "We should have dinner with your sister to celebrate," James suggested a week after our engagement. "She seems fun, and I'd like to get to know your family better." I agreed, pleased by his interest in strengthening family bonds, ignoring the small voice of warning in the back of my mind. That voice grew louder when Natalie arrived at the restaurant wearing a form-fitting dress I'd never seen, her makeup flawless, her laugh a little too eager at James's jokes. "She's just being Natalie," I told myself. "This is how she is with everyone." But as James's questions about my work schedule became more frequent, as his texts became less frequent when I was working late, as Natalie began mentioning running into him by coincidence downtown, those whispers of warning became impossible to ignore. The Matthews case consumed my life in the months following our engagement. As the youngest senior associate assigned to lead a major corporate defense, I was determined to prove myself worthy of the opportunity. 14-hour days became my norm, often extending into weekends as we prepared for trial. "You're missing our cake tasting this Saturday?" James asked one Wednesday night as I packed up case files to review at home. His tone held an unfamiliar edge. "I'm sorry, but the deposition transcripts need to be reviewed before Monday," I explained, guilt washing over me despite knowing this temporary sacrifice was for our future. "Can we reschedule for next week?" James sighed dramatically. "That's what you said about the venue visit last weekend. At this rate, we'll be planning our wedding the night before." I tried explaining the importance of this case to my career trajectory. A successful outcome could mean early partnership consideration, but James had already retreated behind his phone, scrolling with obvious disinterest in my explanation. The distance between us grew as April turned to May. James stopped asking about my cases, and I was too exhausted to bridge the gap. Then came Natalie's seemingly innocent offer during a rare family dinner I'd made time to attend. "You're working yourself to death, Becca," she said, using the childhood nickname I'd always disliked. "Why don't I keep James company sometimes? Take him to those wedding appointments you keep missing? That's what sisters are for, right?" Before I could respond, Mom chimed in. "What a wonderful idea. Natalie has such good taste, and this way, James won't feel neglected." James smiled, too quickly agreeing to this arrangement. Dad gave me a questioning look, but remained silent as usual when it came to potential conflict. 2 weeks later, I found the text messages while using James's iPad to order dinner. They appeared innocently enough, notifications popping up from Natalie about a venue appointment. Curiosity and unease prompted me to open the full conversation. What I found shattered my world. Last night was amazing, read one message from Natalie. She suspects nothing. I miss your touch already, James had replied. Can't wait until Saturday. My hands trembled as I scrolled through weeks of exchanges, each more intimate and explicit than the last. The betrayal had begun just days after. Natalie's offer to help with wedding plans, photos, plans for rendezvous while I was working late, jokes at my expense, mocking my dedication to my career. I confronted James that evening, iPad in hand, his messages displayed on the screen. It's not what it looks like, he began, using the most cliched denial possible. Really? Because it looks like you're sleeping with my sister while I'm working to build our future. His initial denial crumbled quickly under the weight of evidence. Then came the minimizing. It just happened, Rebecca. We were spending so much time together planning your perfect wedding while you were too busy for either of us. It was just physical at first. The at first broke something in me. At first? So now it's more? James's expression shifted from apologetic to defiant. You want the truth? Fine. Natalie is fun, spontaneous, exciting. Everything you used to be before you became obsessed with your career. When was the last time we did anything just for enjoyment? When was the last time you chose me over work? Each word was a knife twisting deeper. I'd heard these comparisons my entire life. Natalie was the fun one, the beautiful one, the one people naturally gravitated toward. But hearing them from the man who had promised to love me forever was unbearable. My suspicion that there was more I didn't know led me to follow James the following Friday when he claimed to be meeting clients. Instead, he drove to Maison Marcel, the French restaurant where he had first told me he loved me. Through the window, I watched him greet Natalie with a passionate kiss before they were seated at a secluded corner table, our regular table. Walking into that restaurant was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but something in me refused to let them enjoy their betrayal in peace, in my special place. How long has this been going on? I asked, standing beside their table, surprising even myself with the steadiness of my voice. The color drained from both their faces. Around us, other diners grew quiet, sensing the unfolding drama. Rebecca? Natalie recovered first, her expression quickly shifting to practiced concern. This isn't how we wanted you to find out. We were going to tell you properly once you weren't so stressed with work. How considerate, I replied, my voice dripping, with sarcasm. James reached for my hand, which I immediately pulled away. Rebecca, I'm sorry it happened this way. But you have to admit, we've been growing apart for months. Natalie and we connect on a different level. She makes time for me. She's not constantly distracted by work. A different level? I repeated incredulously. You mean the level where neither of you have basic human decency or loyalty? Natalie's sympathy act dropped instantly. Don't act so self-righteous, Rebecca. You checked out of your relationship months ago. James needed someone who actually cared about his needs. And naturally, as my loving sister, you stepped up to fulfill those needs. You were never there for him, she snapped. Always at the office, always putting your career first. What did you expect would happen? James nodded along with her. Accusations. With Natalie, I don't have to compete with case files and depositions for attention. She's fun, spontaneous. Less uptight, Natalie added, the final twist of the knife. I removed my engagement ring and placed it on the table between their wine glasses. Congratulations, you deserve each other. The next day, I learned they had already moved in together. The day after that, an email circulated at my firm congratulating me on my personal decision to focus on my career rather than marriage. A humiliating spin clearly orchestrated by James to mutual friends in legal circles. My parents' reaction was the final betrayal. Rather than supporting me, they suggested I had brought this on myself. You know how demanding James's position is. Mom said during an excruciating family dinner I'd been guilted into attending. Men like that need attention, Rebecca. If you were too busy for him. So that justifies him sleeping with my sister? I asked incredulously. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably. No one's saying it was right, but these situations are rarely black and white. The subtext was clear. In their eyes, I shared the blame for my own betrayal. Once again, Natalie emerged unscathed from her actions, while I was left to pick up the pieces alone. The personal devastation bled into my professional life. The Matthews case, once my path to partnership, suffered from my distraction. Though we ultimately won, my performance was noticed for all the wrong reasons. The senior partners expressed concerns about my focus and commitment. In the space of 1 month, I had lost my fiancé, my sister, my parents' support, and my professional momentum. Alone in the apartment James and I had shared, surrounded by wedding magazines and vendor contracts, I reached my breaking point. The Seattle skyline looked nothing like Boston's, and that was precisely what I needed. When my firm offered an internal transfer to their Pacific Northwest office, I accepted within hours. I needed geographical distance to match the emotional chasm that had formed between me and everything familiar. My downtown Seattle apartment became my sanctuary, a place with no memories, no ghosts of betrayal lurking in the corners. I furnished it minimally, a physical manifestation of my desire to start fresh without excess baggage. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Puget Sound, the constant movement of ferries and changing weather patterns becoming meditative companions during long evenings alone. The first few months were solely about survival. I worked, ate when I remembered, slept fitfully, and repeated the cycle. Colleagues invited me to social gatherings, but I declined, not ready to risk new connections. My only concession to self-care was weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Abrams, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who refused to let me hide behind professional accomplishments. The work isn't just showing up here for 50 minutes and checking a box, Rebecca, she said during our third session. The work happens in how you live the other 10,000 minutes of your week. Slowly, painfully, I began dismantling the patterns that had shaped my life. I explored the roots of my achievement addiction, the constant need to prove my worth through professional success. I confronted the competitive dynamic with Natalie that had defined my understanding of love as something that must be earned, rather than freely given. Most importantly, I began recognizing how these patterns had made me vulnerable to someone like James, who had validated my worth through his selection of me, only to confirm my deepest fears by ultimately choosing my sister. Communication with my family dwindled to obligatory holiday calls. Each conversation with my mother inevitably included updates about Natalie and James, delivered with deliberate casualness, as if their relationship wasn't built on the ruins of my happiness. They're looking at houses in Brookline, Mom mentioned, during a Thanksgiving call. James says the market is excellent for buyers right now. I learned to end these calls quickly, citing work commitments. When Dad reached out separately, his awkward attempts at connection always stopped short of acknowledging the family's tacit acceptance of the betrayal. It was easier to maintain surface-level pleasantries than confront the deeper wounds. 8 months after moving to Seattle, I received a call from my firm's managing partner. The Anderson Technologies account has requested you specifically for their expansion into Canadian markets, he explained. They were impressed with your work on their domestic contracts. The initial meeting is at a legal tech conference in Vancouver next week. Immersing myself in work had been my coping mechanism, and it was finally paying dividends. I spent the weekend preparing extensively, determined to channel all my energy into this professional opportunity. The conference occupied the entire Vancouver Convention Center, with panoramic views of the harbor providing a stunning backdrop to the networking events. After my successful meeting with the Anderson executives, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction at the waterfront cocktail reception. "You look like someone celebrating a victory," came a voice to my right. I turned to find a tall man with kind brown eyes and a smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Just a small professional win," I admitted, surprised by my willingness to engage. "Those are often the most satisfying kind," he replied. "I'm Michael Harrington, pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's." "Rebecca Taylor, corporate attorney. You're a long way from the operating room." Michael laughed. "I'm speaking on a panel about medical device patents tomorrow, a necessary evil to ensure our hospital can afford the innovations our patients need." His unpretentious manner and the passion with which he spoke about his work drew me in. Unlike the calculated networking happening around us, our conversation flowed naturally, touching on our respective fields, but also books, hiking trails, around Seattle, and our mutual appreciation for obscure documentary films. When he asked for my number at the end of the evening, my instinct was to decline. Dating felt like an unnecessary risk, a potential distraction from the careful reconstruction of my life. But something about Michael's straightforward approach disarmed my usual defenses. "Full disclosure," he said as he entered my number into his phone. "I'm going to wait 3 days to text you, not because of some dating rule, but because I'll be in surgery until then. Conjoined twins, very complex case." His honesty was refreshing after James's carefully curated charm. When he texted exactly 3 days later with a simple invitation for coffee or whatever beverage fuels your legal brilliance, I found myself accepting. Our first date stretched from afternoon coffee into dinner, as we discovered shared experiences as eldest children who had shouldered heavy expectations. Michael had lost his mother to cancer as a teenager and helped raise his younger siblings while his father worked double shifts. Responsibility and sacrifice were familiar companions to us both. Unlike James, who had pursued me with romantic intensity, Michael moved at a deliberate pace that respected my healing process. When I finally told him about James and Natalie 3 months into our relationship, his response cemented my growing feelings. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said simply, taking my hand across the table. "It explains a lot about your caution. For what it's worth, they sound like remarkably small people who didn't deserve you. No dramatic declarations of how he would never hurt me. No subtle suggestions that perhaps I had contributed to the situation. Just acknowledgement of my pain and recognition of its validity. Our relationship developed with a solid foundation of friendship and mutual respect. Michael understood my dedication to my career because he shared a similar commitment to his own. We supported each other's ambitions rather than competing or keeping score. When he was called away for emergency surgeries or when I needed to work late on case preparations, there was understanding rather than resentment. After 2 years together, during a weekend hiking trip to Mount Rainier, Michael proposed at sunrise with a simple solitaire diamond. "I know what you lost before wasn't just a relationship, but your trust in family and loyalty," he said, his voice steady as he held the ring. "I can't promise we'll never face challenges, but I can promise to face them with integrity and respect for what we've built together. Will you marry me, Rebecca?" My acceptance came without hesitation or doubt. We planned a small wedding at a waterfront restaurant in Seattle, inviting only close friends we'd made together and a few supportive colleagues. My parents received an announcement after the fact, not out of spite, but self-preservation. I wasn't ready to risk their presence triggering memories of my previous engagement, or worse, bringing up Natalie and James. The years that followed were filled with the kind of contentment I hadn't known was possible. We bought a craftsman-style house in Queen Anne with a view of the Space Needle. Michael was promoted to chief of pediatric surgery, while I made partner at my firm. We traveled during our limited overlapping vacation time, explored the Pacific Northwest on weekends, and built a social circle of like-minded couples who understood our demanding careers. 3 years into our marriage, we began discussing starting a family, a conversation approached with the thoughtful consideration we brought to all major decisions. It was during this period of contemplating new beginnings that we received news that would force me to confront my past once more. The call came on a rainy Tuesday in March, 6 years after I'd left Boston behind. I was reviewing contracts in my office when my assistant mentioned my father was on the line, an unusual occurrence given our minimal contact. "Rebecca," his voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered. "It's your mother. The doctors found pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. They're saying 3 months, maybe less." The world tilted on its axis. Despite our complicated relationship, despite her failure to support me when I needed her most, she was still my mother. The woman who had taught me to read before kindergarten, who had stayed up helping me perfect science fair projects, who had, in her imperfect way, shaped the woman I had become. "I'll need to speak with Michael," I said. Professional habits taking over as my emotions threatened to overwhelm me. "I'll call you back tonight with our plans." Michael was scrubbing out of surgery when I reached him. Without hesitation, he offered to rearrange his schedule to accompany me to Boston. "You shouldn't face this alone," he said simply. That evening, as we discussed logistics, Michael gently broached the subject we'd been avoiding. "Will Natalie be there?" he asked, his tone neutral but concerned. "Probably," I admitted, though Dad mentioned she and James broke up years ago. Apparently he left her for someone else not long after I moved to Seattle. A small, shameful part of me felt vindicated hearing this, cosmic justice for what they had done. But the larger part recognized the hollowness of such justice. It hadn't undone the betrayal or healed the family fractures. "Are you ready to see her again?" Michael asked. "No," I admitted, "but I don't think anyone's ever ready to face the person who betrayed them most deeply. I'll manage." We arrived in Boston 5 days later, checking into a hotel rather than staying with family. The familiar skyline, once the backdrop to my greatest professional achievements and personal heartbreaks, felt like visiting a former life. My father greeted us at Massachusetts General Hospital with awkward formality, shaking Michael's hand firmly while giving me a stiff embrace. "She's having a good day," he explained as he led us through antiseptic corridors. "The pain medication is working better than yesterday." Mom looked smaller than I remembered, her once vibrant presence diminished by illness. Her eyes brightened momentarily when she saw me, tears gathering at the corners. "Rebecca," she whispered, "you came." I took her fragile hand, feeling the prominent bones beneath paper-thin skin. "Of course I came." She seemed genuinely pleased to meet Michael, asking about his work and how we had met. There was an unspoken urgency to her questions, as if cataloging the life I'd built without her. During a moment when Dad took Michael to find coffee, Mom gripped my hand with surprising strength. "I need to say this while I can," she began, her voice strained. "I failed you, Rebecca. With James and Natalie, I should have stood by you, not made excuses for them." The acknowledgement I'd needed for years came too late, wrapped in the context of impending loss. Still, it loosened something tight within my chest. "Natalie has struggled since James left," she continued. "Nothing seems to go right for her. She's back living with your father, working temp jobs. She's not the same person." I wasn't sure how to respond to this information. Part of me wanted to say that consequences typically follow actions, but cruelty had no place in this sterile room with its beeping monitors and scent of disinfectant. "I'd like to see you both before I go," Mom said, her eyes closing with fatigue. "To know my girls made peace. Could you try, Rebecca? For me?" It was the kind of deathbed request that weighs heavier than any logical objection. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Later that evening, I received a text from Natalie. "Mom says you're in town. Can we meet tomorrow? Hospital cafeteria at 2? When I arrived the following day, she was already seated at a corner table, a cup of untouched coffee before her. 5 years had changed her more than I expected. The vibrant beauty who had always commanded attention was now thin to the point of gauntness, her once glossy hair dull and carelessly pulled back. She stood. When she saw me, uncertainty in her posture. "Rebecca," she said, her voice smaller than I remembered. "Thank you for coming." We sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of our history pressing down between us. "I heard about Mom's diagnosis," I finally offered. "I'm sorry." "The doctors say it's moving fast," Natalie replied, staring into her coffee. "They don't think she'll make it to summer." Another silence, filled with unspoken accusations and explanations. "I know you probably hate me," she eventually said. "You have every right to. What I did, there's no excuse." It wasn't the groveling apology I might once have fantasized about, but the defeated tone suggested genuine remorse, or perhaps just the consequences of her actions catching up with her. "James left me 3 months after you moved away," she continued when I didn't respond, "for his administrative assistant. Told me I was too needy and not ambitious enough." She laughed bitterly. "Ironic, right? He left you because you were too focused on your career, then left me because I wasn't focused enough on mine." I felt no satisfaction hearing this, just a hollow confirmation of James's character, or lack thereof. "Mom wants us to reconcile before she dies," I said, steering away from James and toward the immediate reality. "I don't know if that's possible, but I can be civil for her sake." Natalie nodded, eyes downcast. "That's more than I deserve." Our interaction was brief and superficial, but it was enough to report back to Mom that we had met without conflict. She smiled weakly, clearly understanding the limitation of what she was asking, but grateful for even this small effort. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, consultations with doctors, and helping Dad navigate end-of-life decisions he wasn't prepared to make. Michael was a steady presence, offering both his medical expertise and emotional support, earning respect from the hospital staff and gratitude from my father. Mom declined rapidly in the final week, slipping into unconsciousness 2 days before she passed. We were all present for her last breath, Dad holding one hand, Natalie and I each holding the other. A moment of unity born from shared grief rather than genuine reconciliation. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday at the church, where we'd attended Christmas services throughout our childhood. As the daughters, Natalie and I were expected to help with arrangements, forcing an uneasy collaboration that reopened old wounds despite our best intentions. "Mom would have wanted lilies, not roses," Natalie insisted during a tense meeting with the florist. "She was allergic to lilies," I countered. "She always had to leave the room when someone brought them as gifts." "That was daylilies specifically," Natalie argued. "She loved calla lilies." Such trivial disagreements masked the deeper conflicts we weren't addressing. We moved through the necessary preparations like actors following a script, playing the roles of grieving daughters without acknowledging the fractured relationship beneath the performance. The evening before the funeral, alone in our hotel room, I finally broke down in Michael's arms. "I don't know how to feel," I admitted through tears. "I'm grieving Mom, but I'm also still angry about everything that happened. And seeing Natalie pretend we're just two sisters mourning our mother." Michael held me, understanding there were no words to resolve such complex emotions. "You don't have to reconcile all those feelings right now," he said gently. "Grief isn't linear or logical. Just feel what you feel, when you feel it." His permission to experience my contradictory emotions without judgment was exactly what I needed. I fell asleep against his chest, grateful once again for the partnership we had built, one based on acceptance rather than expectations. The morning of the funeral arrived with appropriately somber skies, gray clouds hanging low over the city. I dressed carefully in a black sheath dress and pearl earrings that had been a gift from my mother on my law school graduation. Michael looked solemnly handsome in his dark suit, his presence beside me a source of strength as we prepared to face the day. "Ready?" he asked as we stood at the hotel room door. I nodded, taking his hand. "As ready as I'll ever be." St. Mary's Church stood as it always had, its Gothic Revival architecture a landmark in our old neighborhood. Inside, the familiar scent of candle wax and aged wood brought a flood of memories. Sunday services in uncomfortable dresses, Christmas, pageants where Natalie always played the angel while I was relegated to narrator, Mom beaming with pride from the front pew. The closed casket was adorned with a tasteful arrangement of white roses and, yes, calla lilies, a compromise we had eventually reached. Family members I hadn't seen in years approached with awkward condolences, their curiosity about my long absence and successful husband barely concealed beneath expressions of sympathy. "Your mother was so proud of you," my Aunt Susan murmured, though I suspected this was more politeness than truth. Mom had barely known my adult life. Michael navigated these interactions with natural grace, striking the perfect balance between respectful deference to grieving family members and protective support of me. I introduced him to distant relatives and family friends, acutely aware of how little these people knew about the life I'd built in Seattle. Dad sat in the front row, looking lost in his dark suit, accepting handshakes and hugs with mechanical politeness. I sat beside him, Michael on my other side, providing silent support through his presence. The church gradually filled, a testament to Mom's extensive social connections in the community she had never left. At 5 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin, the heavy church doors opened once more. Conversation hushed as Natalie made her entrance, always dramatic. Even in grief, she wore a black dress that emphasized her thinness, her face pale beneath carefully applied makeup. Dad raised his hand to beckon her to our pew. What happened next occurred in slow motion. Natalie walked halfway down the aisle before her gaze, previously fixed on the casket, shifted to where we sat. Her eyes moved past me to Michael, and her entire body froze mid-step. The champagne glass she had inexplicably brought into the church, likely containing water but inappropriate nonetheless, slipped from her suddenly limp fingers, shattering on the stone floor with a crash that echoed through the hushed sanctuary. Color drained from her already pale face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Around us, mourners murmured in confusion, some moving to help clean the broken glass, others watching the unfolding scene with undisguised curiosity. I turned to Michael, baffled by this reaction. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw I recognized from moments when he was processing complex emotions. "Do you know her?" I whispered, confusion mounting. "Later," he replied quietly. "This isn't the place." The minister appeared from a side door, signaling the beginning of the service. Natalie finally unfroze, scurrying to sit beside Dad, as far from Michael as possible while remaining in the family pew. Throughout the eulogy and readings, she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her posture rigid with what appeared to be shock rather than grief. I struggled to focus on the service, my mind racing with questions. Michael's hand remained steady in mine, his thumb occasionally stroking my palm in reassurance, but the subtle tension in his body told me there was something significant he hadn't shared. As the final hymn concluded and mourners began to file out toward the cemetery for the burial, Natalie bolted from the pew, clearly intending to avoid any interaction. The instinct to let her go warred with my need for answers. The latter won. "I'll meet you at the cemetery," I told Michael and Dad, then followed Natalie's retreating figure. I caught up with her in the church vestibule, grabbing her arm as she reached for the door. "What was that about?" I demanded, keeping my voice low but intense. "Why did you react that way to Michael?" She tried to pull away, but I maintained my grip. "Let me go, Rebecca. This isn't the time or place." "No more evasions, Natalie. You looked like you'd seen a ghost. Do you know my husband?" Her eyes darted, around looking for escape. Finding none, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Not personally, she admitted, but I've seen him before, with James. What are you talking about? Michael's voice came from behind me, calm but serious. I can explain this. I turned to find him standing in the vestibule doorway, his expression grave but open. You knew? I asked, confusion giving way to the first stirrings of betrayal. You knew who Natalie was before today? I knew who you were from the beginning, he said quietly. Your name was familiar when we met in Vancouver. Natalie laughed bitterly. Familiar? Is that what you're calling it? He destroyed James's company. Rebecca. He was the investor who pulled out after finding James with me. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Michael had been an angel investor for tech startups. He'd mentioned it casually during our early dating conversations, but I'd never connected it to James's world. James had a deal nearly closed with Harrington Investments, Natalie continued, her voice rising despite the setting. Millions in? Funding for expansion. Then suddenly, after years of relationship building, your husband withdrew completely. No explanation, no alternative funding suggestions. Just complete abandonment when the company was already committed to growth based on promised capital. Michael's expression remained steady. That's not entirely accurate, but the timing is. Correct. I discovered James was engaged to Rebecca Taylor, whose legal work I respected from industry circles. Then I found him with another woman who turned out to be his fiancé's sister. I don't invest in people who demonstrate that level of poor judgment and character, professionally or personally. It was business, Natalie spat. You made it personal and destroyed everything James had built. No, you and James made it personal. When you betrayed someone you both claimed to love, Michael countered, his tone still measured. Actions have consequences in business and in life. His company's failure was the result of multiple factors, including his own mismanagement and overextension. I felt dizzy with revelations. So, when we met in Vancouver, I recognized your name immediately, Michael admitted. I was curious about the woman whose legal brilliance I'd heard about, who had also been entangled with someone like James Warren. I intended only to introduce myself, perhaps have a professional conversation. But you never mentioned this connection, I said, the hurt evident in my voice. Through 3 years of dating and 3 years of marriage. At first, it seemed irrelevant, a strange coincidence that didn't need mentioning during a casual conversation. Then, as we grew closer, I worried. How it would sound, that you might think I'd sought you out deliberately, which wasn't the case. So you orchestrated our entire relationship as some elaborate revenge on James? I asked, the possibility sickening me. No, Michael said firmly. Our meeting was coincidence. Getting to know you was choice. Falling in love with you was inevitable, once I discovered who you truly were. He stepped closer, his eyes holding mine. Rebecca, I intended to tell you eventually. There was never a perfect moment to say, by the way, I might have contributed to your ex-fiancé's financial downfall after he cheated on you with your sister. A laugh bubbled up unexpectedly at the absurdity of the situation. Here we were, in a church vestibule during my mother's funeral, unraveling connections I never could have imagined. You find this funny? Natalie asked incredulously. Not funny, I corrected. Surreal. And telling that you're more concerned about James's failed business than Mom's funeral. That's not fair, she protested weakly. None of this is fair, I replied. But it's where we are. Michael approached carefully. Rebecca, I understand if you need time to process this. It was wrong of me not to tell you earlier. But please, believe that every moment of our relationship has been genuine. I looked between my sister, still defending the man who had used and discarded us both, and my husband, whose omission felt significant, but whose love had never wavered. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming, especially against the backdrop of grief. We're creating a scene at our mother's funeral, I finally said. We should continue this conversation later. As if on cue, the church door opened and my father appeared, concern etched on his face. "Everyone's waiting at the cemetery," he said, glancing between the three of us with confusion. "Is everything all right?" "Fine, Dad," I replied automatically. "We'll be right there." As we moved to follow him, Michael whispered, "I'm sorry. For everything." The genuine remorse in his eyes gave me hope that whatever this complication meant for our relationship, we would find our way through it together. After the burial, I told Michael I needed space to think. He respected my request without protest, taking a cab back to our hotel while I drove with my father to the reception at his house. Throughout the afternoon of casseroles and condolences, I moved through the motions of accepting sympathy while my mind wrestled with what I'd learned. Had my entire relationship with Michael been built on a foundation of half-truths, or was this simply one omission in an otherwise honest partnership? The rational part of me recognized that Michael hadn't orchestrated our meeting. Legal technology conferences weren't exactly romantic hunting grounds. Yet the emotional part felt betrayed by his silence on such a significant connection. I left the reception early, returning to our hotel room to find Michael sitting quietly by the window, staring out at the Boston skyline. He turned when I entered, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "I'll understand if you want me to get another room tonight," he offered. "That's not necessary," I replied, setting my purse down. "But I do need answers. Complete honesty, Michael. No more omissions." He nodded, gesturing to the small sitting area. We sat facing each other, the 5 feet between us feeling like both a necessary buffer and a painful gap. "I want to understand exactly what happened," I began. "From the beginning." Michael took a deep breath. 6 years ago, I was actively investing in medical technology startups. James's company had developed promising patient data management software that several hospitals were interested in. We'd had preliminary meetings, and things were proceeding toward a significant investment. He paused, choosing his words carefully. One evening, I was dining at Sorellina with a colleague when I noticed James at a table across the restaurant with a woman who wasn't his fiancée. Their behavior was unmistakably intimate. It bothered me, not just professionally, but personally. I believe character matters in business partnerships. The following week, during due diligence research, I came across articles about James's engagement to Rebecca Taylor, noted for her work on the Matthews case. The photographs confirmed the woman at dinner wasn't his fiancée. When I discreetly inquired about his personal situation, a mutual connection mentioned rumors of him leaving his fiancée for her sister. The familiar pain of that betrayal resurfaced, but duller now, more distant. "I withdrew from investment discussions," Michael continued. "Not as punishment, but because I genuinely believed someone with such questionable judgment wasn't a sound investment risk. I later heard his company struggled after several expected funding rounds fell through. He had apparently overextended, counting on capital that never materialized. And then Vancouver happened," I prompted. "Pure coincidence," he insisted. "I recognized your name on the conference program and was admittedly curious. I had no intention beyond perhaps introducing myself. But then we met, and you were—" He smiled slightly. "Completely different from what I expected. Brilliant, yes, but also funny and thoughtful and guarded in a way that made me want to earn your trust rather than just expect it. Why didn't you tell me when we started dating seriously?" At first, it seemed unnecessary to mention a strange business connection to your past that might only reopen wounds. Then, as we grew closer, I worried you might question everything about our relationship, that you might think I'd sought you out for some bizarre revenge plot or out of morbid curiosity. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. The longer I waited, the harder it became to find the right moment. By the way, I might have contributed to your ex's business failure after he cheated on you isn't exactly casual dinner conversation. Despite everything, I felt a smile tugging at my lips. You could have worked it into our proposal story. I not only want to be your husband, but I also tanked your ex's company. Michael looked startled, then relieved at my attempt at humor. Would that have worked? Probably not, I admitted. But neither did saying nothing for 6 years. We sat in silence for several moments, the weight of secrets and coincidences hanging between us. I understand if this changes things for you, Michael finally said. If you need time or space or… Do you know what bothers me most? I interrupted. Not that you knew about James and Natalie before we met. Not even that you withdrew investment from his company. It's that you didn't trust me enough to handle this truth. That you made a unilateral decision about what I needed to be protected from. Understanding dawned in his eyes, just like your family did when they decided what narrative to believe about your engagement ending. Exactly, I confirmed. I've spent my entire life having others decide what truths I can handle. My parents believing Natalie's version of events. My firm accepting James's spin that I chose career over marriage. Even you, deciding I was better off not knowing about your connection to my past. Michael nodded slowly. I never saw it that way, but you're right. I made assumptions about how you'd react, rather than giving you the agency to process the information, yourself. I'm sorry, Rebecca. Truly. His apology felt genuine, acknowledging the real issue rather than just the surface transgression. Where do we go from here? He asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. This revelation was significant, but existed within the context of 6 years of trust and partnership. Michael had made a mistake in judgment, but not one of character or commitment. Forward, I finally answered. Together. But with complete honesty from now on, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. Relief washed over his features as he reached for my hand. I met him halfway, our fingers intertwining in the familiar pattern that had always brought comfort. No more secrets, he promised, even the difficult ones. The next morning, I arranged to meet Natalie at a coffee shop near our old neighborhood. I arrived early, securing a quiet corner table and ordering a cappuccino to steady my nerves. She appeared precisely on time, looking more collected than at the funeral, but still bearing the gaunt, strained appearance of someone struggling under multiple burdens. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again, she said, sliding into the chair, opposite mine. I'm not here to rehash old wounds, I clarified. But I think we both deserve closure, especially after yesterday. She nodded, staring into her coffee. James left me 3 months after you moved away. Did I mention that? You did. His company started failing not long after your husband pulled his investment. A hint of accusation lingered in her tone. Michael wasn't the only investor who withdrew, I pointed out. And from what I understand, James had already committed to expansions without secured funding. That's poor business strategy, not Michael's fault. She sighed heavily. I know. I just needed someone to blame besides myself when everything fell apart. James certainly blamed me, said I was bad luck, that everything had been fine until I came along. The irony wasn't lost on me. He said similar things to me about my career. Focus. It seems James excels at avoiding responsibility. He moved to California with some startup incubator. Last I heard, he was dating a yoga instructor half his age. Natalie laughed bitterly. Meanwhile, I'm 34, living in Dad's guest room, temping as an administrative assistant, and spending my weekends helping him organize Mom's clothes for donation. For the first time, I truly looked at my sister, not as the perpetual rival or betrayer, but as another woman whose life had taken difficult turns. Behind the beauty that had always been her defining feature, I recognized something I'd never seen before. Profound insecurity. Why did you do it, Natalie? I asked softly. Not just James, but everything before. Always taking what mattered. To me. She remained silent for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because you always seemed so sure of yourself, so complete without needing anyone's approval. I was terrified of being overlooked, forgotten. Mom and Dad expected me to be the pretty one, the social one, but that's not an identity that lasts. You had something real, intelligence, determination, a path forward. Tears gathered in her eyes. Every time I took something from you, it was like trying to grab a piece of that certainty for myself. But it never worked. The boyfriends, the opportunities, even James, none of it made me feel secure. And then I'd do it again, hoping the next time would fill whatever was missing. Her raw honesty struck a chord. All these years, I'd seen Natalie as the favored daughter, never recognizing her actions as desperate attempts to establish her own value. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued, wiping her eyes. "What I did was unforgivable. I just wanted you to know it was never really about you. It was my own emptiness I was trying to fill." For the first time, I felt something beyond anger or hurt when looking at my sister, a complex mixture of pity, understanding, and the faintest glimmer of compassion. "I forgive you, Natalie," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "Not because you deserve it or because Mom wanted us to reconcile. I forgive you because holding on to this anger only hurts me." Her head snapped up, disbelief evident. In her expression, "Just like that?" "No, not just like that. It's taken years of therapy and building a new life to reach this point. Forgiveness doesn't mean what you did was okay. It doesn't even mean we'll have a close relationship moving forward. It just means I'm not carrying the weight of what happened anymore." "What happens now?" she asked tentatively. "Now we establish boundaries that work for both of us. I'll always be your sister, Natalie, but trust has to be earned back gradually, if at all. We can start with occasional calls, perhaps holiday cards, small steps." She nodded, seemingly understanding that this was more than she could have reasonably expected. We parted with an awkward hug, the first physical contact we'd had in 6 years. Michael was packing our suitcases when I returned to the hotel. We had an afternoon flight back to Seattle, back to the life we'd built together. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than expected," I replied honestly. For the first time, I think I understand her. Not in a way that excuses what she did, but in a way that helps me make peace with it. He smiled softly. "That's a gift you've given yourself, not her." "The same could be said about forgiving you," I pointed out. His expression grew serious. "Are we okay, Rebecca? Really?" I crossed the room and took his hands in mine. "We're more than okay. This whole experience has made me realize something important. What happened with James and Natalie wasn't the tragedy I thought it was. It was the detour that led me to where I was supposed to be all along." The tension he'd been carrying since the funeral visibly released. "When I saw her reaction yesterday, I was terrified I might lose you over a decision I made years before we met." "It would take much more than that to lose me," I assured him. "We've built something real, Michael. Something based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. That's worth protecting." 2 days after returning to Seattle, I took a home pregnancy, tests that confirmed what I'd begun to suspect in Boston. The timing was earlier than we'd planned, but felt right nonetheless. Michael's joy at the news erased any lingering shadows from our Boston revelations. As we prepared for this new chapter, I reflected on the strange, winding path that had led us here. The betrayal that once seemed like the end of my world had ultimately guided me to a deeper understanding of myself and what I truly needed in a partner. The sister who had caused me such pain had inadvertently set me free from relationships that valued appearance over substance. The past will always be part of my story, but it no longer defines me. I've learned that genuine love doesn't require perfection, from ourselves or others, but it does demand honesty, respect, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths together. Life rarely follows the path we expect, and sometimes the most Painful detours lead to the most beautiful destinations. If you're navigating your own difficult journey right now, remember that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. It might just be the unexpected beginning of something better than you ever imagined. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately led you somewhere better? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear that pain can transform into unexpected blessings. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes life's biggest heartbreaks are just redirecting you to your greatest happiness.